I'm Remy Pangle with the Center for Wind Energy at James Madison University, and today we will be talking about Task 3A, the Alternative Energy Plan Siting and Resource Assessment for the Pre-Host School Research Project as part of the Virginia Wind for Schools program. So first we will be talking about wind and solar energy system siting basics, then we'll talk about wind and solar data collection, and then we'll get into the proposed methodology, proposed tools, sample rubric. We will review the timeline, and we will review the idea of contacting experts to help with your project. So first we need to understand the characteristics of the wind. So wind is intermittent. So obviously it's not windy all the time, every day of the year. Or all times of the day for that matter. It's very seasonal, typically stronger in the winter. And wind speeds increase with elevation. So as you can see from the figures here, the higher you go off the ground, the further away you are from obstructions such as trees and buildings, the stronger your airflow. And of course, all of this is not only seasonally dependent, but it's also geographically dependent. It's not windy everywhere. So the next thing we want to talk about are the wind patterns. And so as you can see, very geographically dependent. If I were to build a wind farm today, I would probably focus on the middle of the United States where the highest wind speeds are. And as you look at this map and the distribution of wind speeds, especially here in Virginia, you may start to understand that the wind patterns are very dependent on the topography of the land. So in Virginia, you can see that most of our higher wind speeds tend to be along the mountain ridges and along the coastline, and especially offshore of Virginia. So when it comes to siting a wind turbine, there are lots of things to take into consideration. The first thing, and probably the most thing, is you want to maximize your access to the prominent wind direction. And here in Virginia, it's usually from the west, either the southwest or the northwest predominantly. Of course, it does come from other directions at different times of the year. Again, you also want to avoid obstructions. So the rule of thumb is you want to be 30 feet taller than anything within 500 feet of you. So if you look at the diagram below, you'll see that they're taking this into consideration. They're using a different rule of thumb, a 20-foot rule of thumb, but the higher the better. So in this diagram, you can see that they're trying to site these wind turbines at least 20 feet higher than that building and at least 20 feet higher than those trees, especially if they're in front of the turbine in the direction of the prevailing wind. The other thing we need to consider is abiding by the local zoning rules, such as setbacks and height restrictions. And this is something that will be very county or city specific. So you'll definitely want to make sure to get in touch with your local planning board to understand those rules. You definitely want to minimize the distance of the turbine to the electrical panels. If you know where you're going to connect your electricity from the wind turbine to, where your electric panel is in your school, then you want to make sure that you keep the turbine roughly 150 feet or so from that site. So less than 150 feet. After that, it gets a lot more expensive. The gauge of the wire it has to be a thicker wire. It also has extra trenching, so the costs are going to go up. And then, of course, being aware of the visibility. And I say be aware of visibility because depending on your project and depending on your location, you may want to maximize visibility to enhance the educational value of the turbine so most people are seeing it. However, you might be in a place where you've got lots of people who live near the school and you want to minimize visibility so that they don't complain about the potential aesthetics. So considering your visibility is important. So as you can tell, the wind siting is a little bit more complicated. Solar is a little bit easier. It's not as geographically dependent in terms of topography. If you look here at the solar insolation pattern, so this is the amount of photovoltaic solar resource here in the United States. And if you look at the United States, there's an obvious benefit of putting solar in the Southwest. However, if you look at Virginia, you pretty much can put it anywhere in Virginia. In terms of a solar resource, it's not going to change a whole lot. However, you still have some things to consider when you're siting the solar panels. So especially if you're planning on putting solar panels on the roof of a school or a house, you may need to look at the age of the roof. If the roof is old, then it may have to be replaced before you can put solar panels on it. And at that point, you may want to consider a ground-mounted system. So you can locate your solar panels on racks on the ground, or you can create a shed for storage that the roof is new and has solar panels on it. So there's lots of opportunities and different ways to be creative in terms of locating your solar panels. The biggest thing to consider is you want to maximize access to the sun, so you want to pay attention to your orientation. Here in Virginia, you want your solar panels to face south. If you face south, the sun will always be south of us because the sun is over the equator and we are north of the equator. So you'll see the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. It'll always be south of us. You obviously want to avoid shading, so you don't want to be near trees. You don't want to be near eaves of buildings or chimneys or other buildings. So you need to better understand the shading, and not only the day that you're out there, but think about the way the sun moves and how your shadows are going to look different in June versus December when the sun is a little bit lower in the sky. The other thing is, again, you need to abide by local zoning rules. And again, you want to minimize that distance from the panels to the electrical box. So that's the basics of solar siting. Again, it's not as complicated as with the wind. We talked about some basic things, but there's a lot more to consider when we consider siting wind turbines. We can get into that in more detail. So now that's the siting part. The other part of our task is the resource assessment. And this is basically understanding how much wind or sun is available to us, so we can actually make estimates of how much solar energy or wind energy we can actually harness at our site. So not only where they go, but how well are they going to work. So for measuring the wind, there are many different ways we can measure the wind, depending on the grade level of your students and depending on how much detail you want to get into. You can start small and think about the Beaufort scale, which is a way that we observe things around us to get an estimate of what the wind speeds might be. So if you look at the chart, if the small trees begin to sway, you can estimate that to be about 19 to 24 miles an hour. More detail from there could be a windsock. It will tell you a little bit more information about the direction of the wind and the strength of the wind. There's something called flagging, which we don't usually see around here because it's just not that windy, but in other very windy locations, you can actually see the trees growing with deformity because of the wind being so prominent in a certain direction. So it can tell you how windy it is by the level of deformity, as well as what direction the wind comes from. And then for the ultimate detail, you would use an anemometer and a wind vane to tell you wind speed and direction. And the image that you see here is of a meteorological tower. And meteorological towers are large towers that are equipped with anemometers and wind vanes. And in the picture that you see on the right hand of your screen, you see a meteorological tower that we installed in Augusta County. And this is 166 feet tall, and it has 2 anemometers and 2 wind vanes at 3 different levels. So again, we've got 2 anemometers at each height that are in different directions. So it gives you quality assurance measurements. And then the 3 different heights allows you to better understand the way the wind is increasing with height, so your wind shear. So in order to understand better where to find some data, I'm going to give you some ideas. So first of all, we talked about meteorological towers, and meteorological towers are put up all over the state of Virginia, and we archive all of that data. So if you're interested in meteorological data, we can you can contact the Center for Wind Energy, and we can help you to get data from a meteorological tower that was located close to your school. The other thing you can do is you can look at the archived weather data through the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, and that will give you some more data points. You could also purchase your own personal weather station, or maybe your school already has a WeatherBug station or some other weather station, and you can actually measure your own wind speeds, directions. And then airports also gather their own weather data. So if you are located near an airport, you could contact the airport and ask for their archived wind weather data. And lastly, I noticed that we showed you these wind maps that show wind patterns, and you can use those to get a rough estimate of your annual average wind speed as well. The big thing to remember is that in order to get high quality analysis for your resource assessment, you really do need to have 1 or more years of data. So anywhere you can find that data would be great. So the next thing we have to think about is adjusting for height. I mentioned wind shear, and wind shear is the way that the wind changes with height. And if you're measuring the wind at, say, 10 feet from a weather station, but you want to use that to understand how windy it is at, say, 100 feet where your wind turbine might be, then you need to adjust for that difference in height, because understandably it would be higher, the wind speed would be higher at the higher height. So this is a simple equation that you can use to estimate or extrapolate the wind speed at a different height. So you need the wind speed at your weather station, and then the height of your weather station, and then you need to understand the height that you want to extrapolate that to. And we also need something called the wind shear exponent. And again, if you're not using a Met tower that has anemometers on multiple levels, then we usually use a default of 1/7 as the wind shear exponent. And plugging all that information in, you can get the wind speed at your new height or your hub height. So measuring the wind is a little bit more tricky than measuring solar energy. So solar energy, if you remember from our solar patterned map, is relatively consistent throughout at least the state of Virginia. But if you want to get better measurements, you can also use a pyranometer. A pyranometer is an instrument that measures light intensity. And you could probably order at many of the science supply catalogs that you already use. So now that we have data, we've found our wind data or our solar data, there are some important graphs that you should use in order to examine your data better. The first is a time series, and a time series is just plotting all of the wind or solar measurements over the entire time period that you collected it for. Within that time series, you may see some patterns, such as an annual or seasonal cycle, or even a diurnal cycle. So some other graphs that you could do is to use a monthly mean wind speed or solar insolation to get an annual cycle. So it'll show a little bit cleaner that cycle. And then you can also show a diurnal cycle, which all you have to do is plot all of the data from one full day. And you should see the way the wind speeds or the solar insolation increases and decreases over the course of a day. In terms of wind, we also like to know what direction the wind is coming from over the full year. And to visualize that, we use something called a wind rose. And it basically tells us the frequency that wind is coming from certain directions throughout the year. And then the last piece of information that we like to pull out of this data is what we call the frequency distribution. And for wind data, this is an important graph because it is used along with the power curve for intended wind turbine to understand the energy output. So in order to create a frequency distribution, you use your raw data and you put it into bins. So you count how many times a data point lies from 1 to 2 meters per second, or 2 to 3 meters per second. And this is how many times does the wind blow at a certain speed throughout that period of time. And so that will tell you what's the most prominent wind speed. And all of those graphs together will give you a full characterization of your resource.